In this video, I am going to demonstrate how to use Amazon's API Gateway service and Amazon Lambda in order to create an echo orchestration for unique. Orchestration takes incoming text or audio from a user and sends it to a natural language processing system. On the reply, it transforms the JSON into the appropriate format. So API Gateway exposes a post endpoint, and Lambda can be the code that will send that request along and then transform the JSON on the reply. And setting this up is very easy. As you can see, we're on the API Gateway. You can search for Lambda, or of course, I've used it recently, so it's in my history. We'll just click on Lambda. I find it's easier to set this up from the Lambda service first and work backwards. We're going to create a new function. You can call this whatever you want. I will call it demo orchestration service. Any runtime that AWS Lambda supports. For this video, I'm going to use Ruby. You could, of course, do this in any language. And you need to create a role. So if you have a role already, that's great. If you would like to allow the system to sort of do it for you, there's a policy template right there for you. And in this case, we're just going to give the role a name. So this is a test role, and I'll delete that afterwards. Create this function. Once your Lambda function is created, you will see the designer open automatically. And on the left, you see a button for add trigger. This is where we will configure the API gateway. But for the moment, we're just going to collapse the designer and walk through the function code a little bit. One thing that's not immediately clear, just from looking at this, is the purpose of the handler. And it is in the documentation, but just to give a description, Lambda function is the name of the file. So they have created lambda underscore function.ruby for us. And then Lambda handler is the function inside that file that will be called when a request is made to this Lambda function. And they have given us a Lambda handler function predefined. So you can rename these whatever you want. Of course, you can create classes if you're using a language that supports that. Of course, in this case, because what we're doing is simple, all we need is the method itself. And I've already written the code for this, so I'm going to paste that in. So here is the Ruby function in its entirety, the entire file. I've left Lambda handler as the beginning name. Again, you can do whatever you want with that. And then when you're passing parameters into Lambda handler, Amazon's documentation specifies that you should pass in event and context. The event in our case, because this will be coming from API Gateway, is analogous to the body payload of the inbound request. So you can see some logging. Amazon Lambda will not automatically log the event body to CloudWatch. So you should, if you want, put a put statement, or if you're using Node or some of the library, whatever console command logs to standard out or standard error, you can use those types of invocations. So console.log, console.warn in JavaScript would work. And then in this case, specifically, we want the body of that entire event, because you're going to see headers and things like that coming across in the logs. The next thing for Ruby specifically is we're going to need to parse the event body into JSON for our purposes. So this is one of those tricky things where I was looking through Lambda. If you're testing with something like Postman, for example, and your service that is going to consume the API gateway handles things slightly differently, if you're passing stringified a hash or JSON object back and forth, you're going to need to transform that. And in a second, we'll look at the test environment for that. Lastly, and this is not super clear from their documentation, but the response to the HTTP gateway must be in this format. It must have status code, it must have a header object, and then there, of course, should be a body, which is the reply. So I initially was not aware that status code and headers in this format was explicitly required, and we were seeing 500 errors. But the code was working fine and the tests were passing. So just make sure that you're not getting tripped up by that. If you're using HTTP API proxy to come into Lambda, you must reply from Lambda in this explicit format. So the code from here on out is really simple and just a high-level explanation of what we're doing. When we speak to our digital human, we say, hello. This is simply going to take what I said, and the digital human will say that back to me. So if I say hello, the digital human will say hello. If I say, what color is the sky? The digital human will say, what color is the sky? What we would require from here is define request to NLP, for example. And in this section, we would need to have maybe a library for Ruby, something like HTTP party post to some API nlp.com, and there would have to be the request, right? The request, and in our case, we call the body of the request FM question. So we might pass that over. So this part right here is missing from the orchestration layer. And if you're watching this video in order to define your own orchestration layer, just understand that you will need to add some function that will reach out to that natural language processing and then return the JSON. In this case, we're just making a round trip. So now that I've created the function itself, I need to go to the top right and click Save. It also, Lambda gives us the ability to configure test events, which is great. The templates that it will give us all of the code we need out of the box. And so Amazon API Gateway, AWS Proxy, when I select that as a template, I get what would be a request from the API Gateway to Lambda in its entirety, right? So this entire object with all of these key value pairs are going to come across. Some of this is very unnecessary. You won't see all of these things, like CloudFront is mobile viewer. That may or may not be there for you, but most of the elements will in fact be present. And for the body, you could, of course, define some JSON object, right? So some key, that's not how we spell key. And then, right, maybe some value goes here, et cetera, et cetera. So you could define the payload that would be coming from the API gateway in this configurable test event, and then click create. And then you can actually run that by clicking test. And you will see the result of that test at the top of this page, which should help you make sure that your code is functioning fine prior to actually trying to invoke this from your service. Now we need to go back to our designer and add a trigger. And this is where it gets really easy. So for me, API Gateway pops at the top because I've used it. You can naturally search for it. Amazon makes that really easy. And you will see the new API, right? I have an existing HTTP API that I've already created. Before this video, we're going to create a new one here. You're going to leave it to HTTP API. And you're going to come down and perhaps give it a name. So under the additional settings, you may want to call this, demo orchestration service, and it automatically adds -API for us. Give it whatever name you want. The deployment stages for this video, just leave it at default, and then we can click add. It is that easy to stitch these two services together, right? So in just a couple seconds, we have a successful service, and under the API Gateway section down here, it tells us what the endpoint is. So this endpoint is where we need to copy. We're just going to highlight all of that. We're going to copy that, open up Postman, and I'm going to paste that in here. I've got a body that has been predefined. So these are just some key value pairs that are relevant to our service. When we click send, I'm going to get that back. So at the bottom it says, what is your name? I'm going to say, what color is the sky? And you can see that in the result, what color is the sky came back. So this answer is properly formatted for our service. Your service, if you're watching this video unrelated to our company, would be different clearly, but that is it. It's online, it's working. It is using the HTTPS protocol. It is hitting our API endpoint, which you can name whatever you want. It doesn't have to be capital demo orchestration. You can just have one word, like most APIs would have, a create action, something like that. And we have a functional serverless service that is available to consume immediately.